having you here with us tonight. And thank you all for coming back to Session 4, Raising Healthy Kids. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the term transgender? Almost every hand. I've been talking about this particular subject for, I want to say 5 or 6 years now. When I first started, and I go into a church or a meeting like this and say, how many of you ever heard of transgender? Nobody put their hand up. Over the last few years, it has just exploded. And most of us would probably fall into one of 3 categories. Some think transgender is a wonderful thing, and they want to affirm it. Others think it's awful, and they do their best to avoid it. The rest would just try and ignore it. But as you'll soon see, Christians do not have the luxury of adopting any of those attitudes. So we're going to address for the next few moments the subject of male and female and transgender. We're going to do it with compassion. And, as a father of 4, in my opinion, this content is appropriate for all ages. But by the time we're through, I hope you have a better understanding of the issue. And I'll field whatever questions you may have along the way. But first, if you're wondering why I bring this up in this kind of setting, like church, let me remind you, transgender is kind of at the heart of our culture right now. For example, June. June has a new nickname. Does anybody know what we call June now? Pride Month. So I stopped by my local library. This is from 2019. I picked this up at the Ocean County Library. It is a 40-page brochure of all the LGBTQ events taking place in Ocean County alone in the month of June. And every county has one of these. Not to mention, I like to go and look at the young adult reading in the library. This is a free bookmark I picked up you are all in Ocean County right now, in the Ocean County Library. And it gives great suggestions for summer reading. This has 14 LGBTQ titles that include Some Assembly Required, The Not-So-Secret Life of Transgender Teens, and Rethinking Normal. This is all stuff I just picked up at the library. That's not even considering online media or television or movies. And so, if your kids haven't encountered transgender yet, it's just a matter of time. And I hope this session helps you answer the question about biblical gender with gentleness and respect. So if you want to get prepared, in a minute we're going to take another quiz, a transgender IQ quiz. But first let's define what we're talking about. According to Mary Bowerman of USA Today, a transgender is a person whose internal sense of themselves as male or female is different than the body they're born in. Their gender identity, that's a word everybody should know right now. Gender identity, brain genders. Any of you familiar with Jazz Jennings, I Am Jazz? This book, I Am Jazz, caused a lot of controversy, being read in a lot of grade school classrooms about a young boy's transition to girl. Jazz Jennings explains it as brain gender is different than natal or body gender. Natal gender is a new term that's being used to describe gender that is assigned at birth. That's how the secular world sees it. Child is born, doctor pronounces, it's a boy, it's a girl, your gender is assigned. Completely different than a Christian worldview that sees gender as being given by God in creation. We'll look more at this as we continue through. So, gender identity. I identify as a male or a female. Someone does not identify as their natal gender, then they are either gender non-conforming, or more importantly, another word you should know, gender dysphoric. Gender dysphoric is a word you're going to hear me use throughout the course of the night. And it's a big one because it's the official diagnosis of an individual who rejects their natal gender. And there are multiple symptoms. They range from anxiety and depression, to a desire to be the other gender, to an extreme dislike of your own anatomy. Now, over the past few years, transgender has become a major issue in our culture. For example, if I could direct your attention to the screen, celebrities like Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner have been featured on the cover of magazines like Time and Vanity Fair. And not only have they been portrayed as glamorous and content, but as a result, the once clear line between male and female has been blurred in our culture. Then came the summer of 2016, where Target caused its share of controversy by making a policy that people can use whatever bathroom they identify with. There's gender identity in practice. Some thought this was a brilliant idea. Others thought it was so disturbing they boycotted Target. One thing they had in common is that everyone was talking about it. Meanwhile, how many of you are familiar with CoverGirl makeup? Well, okay, me too, yeah. 2016, CoverGirl also presented their very first male CoverGirl. Think about that. A male girl is no longer an oxymoron in our culture. But we're not done. Culture is fluid. It's moving. It's constantly changing. So, January 2017, National Geographic devoted an entire issue to this subject. Here's a screenshot of the title, Gender Revolution. I have a copy here. If any of you want to look at this, or I Am Jazz, or anything else, you are welcome to check this out afterwards. But just remember, thou shalt not steal. Yeah, take a look now. Be detectives. Look at the cover. Think, nothing on that cover is done by accident. That is one of the most intentional covers you'll ever see. What do you notice? Let me help you out. What is the official symbol of LGBTQ? The rainbow, thank you. How many colors are in a rainbow? ROYGBIV. 7, good. How many kids on the cover? 7. Notice they're all young people too. 7 young people. Do you notice how they're arranged like a rainbow? Do you notice they're all different colors like a rainbow? I'm trying to make a point here. I want you to notice the designers of this cover didn't make any mistakes when they put that cover together. And if you can read it, you'll see there's some pretty strange titles. Somebody identifies as bigender, there's a transgender female, intersex, non-binary, androgynous, a male. They really put a lot of thought into this, except something's missing from the cover. Can anybody catch it? Female. No female on the cover of the gender issue of National Geographic. Believe me when I tell you, I'm not the only one to notice. Editors got in a lot of trouble for deliberately omitting females. What does all this mean? It means it leaves us with some really big problems as you're raising kids in this culture. You have to answer questions like, if you're a boy, can you change into a girl, vice versa? Or is being male and female something God makes you? Are there more than 2 genders? These are topics I plan to address today, so let's take the quiz. Are you ready?
Yes. Ready.
Okay, good. Question 1. The number of transgender people in the United States of America is currently estimated at A, less than 1% of the population, B, between 1 and 3, C, between 3 and 5, D, between 5 and 10%. Okay, I'm hearing A, C, D, and B. It's a conflicted audience. The most recent data suggests the number of transgender individuals in America is 0.6%. A is correct. You'd think it was a lot more, wouldn't you? However, the generally accepted statistic up until 2017 was 0.3%. Meaning that number has doubled in the last 10 years and continues to grow at a disproportionate rate. And USA Today also reports that an even larger disproportionate number of children and teens identify as transgender. There's an estimated 150,000 teens who identify as transgender in our country, and that number is growing. As we discuss raising healthy kids, I'm hoping you're sitting there asking yourself, what if my kid What if my grandkid? What if a kid in my ministry had symptoms of gender dysphoria? Would I be able to help them? What can I do? Is accepting their claims what's really best for them? Is there a better way? Next question. The suicide rate for transgenders in America is A, slightly lower than the general population, B, about the same, C, slightly higher, D, significantly higher. The answer is D. You all know it. I know it. It's a sad fact. Now, tonight we're talking about transgender. Tomorrow night we're going to talk about substance abuse. And then the last night, Saturday night, we're going to talk about self-harm and suicide. Real issues for kids today. The suicide rate, I'll remind you, in 2 nights. It's calculated from reported suicide attempts per 100 people. The general rate for people in America is 1.6%. Pretty much right across the board. The rate for transgender people in America is 41%. That means if you talk to a person who identifies as transgender, there's almost a 50-50 chance that person has tried or will try to kill themselves. And if that doesn't generate a little compassion in you, I don't know what will. Suicide rate is important for 3 reasons. Number 1, it's used to diagnose gender dysphoria. It's one of the 8 features. Number 2, it's used for political leverage. The argument is we as a society must provide transgender people with everything they need to transition, or else they're going to do what? Kill themselves. But number 3, and here's the important statistic, the one that doesn't get reported in the media. The suicide rate is equal to, or in some instances, higher for those who've undergone transition than for those who have not. The point there is that providing affirmation or the chemicals and surgeries to transition, it doesn't prevent suicide. Last question. Can the Bible really help us understand complicated contemporary gender issues like this?
Yeah.
You better believe it. So what do you say to your child when your child asks you, did God make a mistake and put a girl brain in a boy body? Let me give you a crash course in biblical gender. It goes all the way back to the foundation, Genesis 1, which describes the creation of human beings as follows. I'll be reading out of the ESV, Genesis 1, 26 and 27. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, what does that have to do about gender? First thing I'd like you to notice is that we can glean from this passage is that in a very special way, all human beings represent our Creator. We're bearers of his image and his likeness. Going back to the first night, this is the Imago Dei. So not only does the Bible teach that we are distinct from every other creature, but we're also superior by design. That's what dominion means. And this is important because from the word go, creation and evolution are irreconcilable. You can't believe in both. And for now, I want to draw your attention to the word man in verse 27. You guys ready to learn a little Hebrew? I sound excited. It's fun, okay? That word man is pronounced Adam. Say Adam.
Adam.
Look at that. You're naturals. Okay, Adam, in this case, context, it doesn't just mean the first guy God ever created. And it doesn't just mean males in general. In this sense, Adam means the entire human race bears the image of God. And if you doubt me, I'll refer you to Genesis 9, verse 6. And I'll ask you to consider, how does that one fact change the way we ought to treat all human beings, including those who struggle with sexual orientation, gender identity? Underneath it all, there is a common denominator. And also understand, from the beginning, all human beings are very special to God. He loves us all so much. He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to become one of us, and then to die in our place as a sacrifice for our sin, even the ones who struggle with sexual orientation and gender identity. Paul reminds us, the church, in 1 Corinthians 6, they can be redeemed through faith in Christ when he writes, "But such were some of you, but you were washed." And so the first thing we learn from the beginning is God made the entire human race in His image. And then we learn He made it as either male or female. Here comes Hebrew part 2. The typical Hebrew word for man is ish. Say ish.
Ish.
Good. And the typical word for woman is isha. Say isha.
Isha.
Okay, ish, isha. Those are the usual words for man and woman, but they are not used here in Genesis 1. Instead, there are two really unique words used here. They're both adjectives. I won't make you say them. For male, it's zakar. For female, it's nikeva. And all that means, if I was to translate Genesis 1:27 for you, I would translate it like this so you capture the idea. God created human beings in His image. In the image of God, He created them. He created a male one and a female one, making all human beings equal in value but distinct in gender. So gender distinction, it's part of the natural order of creation. Something Paul alludes to in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 15. This is where we get the concept of a binary gender, two genders. And traditionally, Christians have understood gender binary to look like this. Males are on one side. Now, all males are not the same. Some, like Esau in Genesis 25, they're hairy hunters. Others, like his twin brother Jacob, they're clean-shaven cooks. But one thing they all have in common is that they're all male. Even males who are born with ambiguous genitals or extra chromosomes are males. And not all females are the same either. Some are slender and prefer dresses. Others may be bigger and prefer sports. Some may even have facial hair or ambiguous genitalia. But the key is that all females are what? Female. This is where a traditional Christian worldview conflicts with a secular one. Because as you saw from the National Geographic cover, the world doesn't view gender as binary, not anymore. The world now views gender as a spectrum, with males at one end and females at the other, and many, many stops in between. I think at last count, Facebook lets you choose from up to 58 different genders. Now, the woman credited with making this fluid or non-binary, meaning not just two, view of gender is named Anne Foster Sterling. She argued way back in the 70s that some people, like transgender or intersex, they don't fit neatly into the category of male or female. So she created additional classification. And remember, these are her terms, not mine. She said there are herms, or true hermaphrodites. And I'm going to use the term intersex and hermaphrodite interchangeably, and I'll explain it more in a minute, but for now, this is what she came up with. She also said there are merms, or male-leaning hermaphrodites, and she said there are firms, or female-leaning hermaphrodites, and just like that, one idea changed the game. She provided the rationale for people to move from one side of the spectrum to the other, and Christians have been very quiet and slow to respond to it because we don't like to bring this stuff up in church or with our kids. It makes us uncomfortable. What happens if someone's born without genitals or has them removed? Can the Bible actually speak to that? And the answer, believe it or not, is yes. Jesus addressed it. In Matthew 19, when he was asked about marriage and divorce and singleness, he responded that from the beginning God created one man for one woman. But he didn't stop there. He went on to make one of the most beautiful and complicated statements in Scripture. He said in Matthew 19, verse 12, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it's given. Translation. If you're looking for an easy answer, you're not going to find it here, but here's the answer. There are eunuchs who have been so from birth. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive it, receive it. Let me give you a brief explanation here. The first two, those who are born eunuchs with ambiguous genitalia, those who are made eunuchs, castrated. Okay, those are two physical conditions. The third one, made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, are people who have decided to remain single in order to serve the Lord. This is something Paul elaborates on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This just means Christ recognized because of sin and the curse, there are people who are born blind. There are people who are born with deformed hands or deformed feet. And there are people who are born with deformed genitalia. A doctor by the name of Leonard Sachs provides the most conservative estimate I can find. He argues that 1 in every 5,000 live births qualifies as intersex, meaning they don't have typical male or female body parts. You would look at them and you would say, I'm not sure if that's a guy or a girl. Others insist the rate is much higher, but even at the lowest figures, Dr. Sachs's figures would indicate in the United States alone there are as many as 50,000 intersex persons. Intersex is a real condition. And with that, there's 3 things you should know. Number 1, there's no true human hermaphrodite. In nature, there are hermaphrodites. That means has both male and female body parts and is capable of reproduction. Some fish are hermaphrodites. Some plants are hermaphrodites. Not only are there no human hermaphrodites, there are no mammalian hermaphrodites. But there are abnormalities known as intersex. And LGBT, that movement, appeals to the physical condition of intersex in order to justify transgender in our culture. The argument sounds like, see, there's more than 2 genders. This is called a philosophical defeater or mascotting. And the church really needs to make a distinction because, number 2, intersex people have been marginalized throughout history. It's a really sad history. In the pagan Roman culture, when a child was born intersex, do you know what would typically happen to that child? We have a record of 11 births between 100 BC and 100 AD of children who were at intersex. 8 of those 11 were drowned at birth because they were considered a bad omen. The other 3, we don't know what happened to them. Okay, they've been, even up to today, some have been excluded from contemporary churches, and it's just not right. But the amazing thing is, as Christianity began to infiltrate the Roman Empire, the church had no problem with intersex persons, people who were born with these deformities. And they actually left us a model for how to approach intersex persons or even redeemed transgenders. Are you all familiar with Augustine, the Doctor of Grace? In one of his classics, City of God, he addresses this very issue 1,600 years ago. I'll let you read an excerpt. He said, at Hippo, his hometown, where he was the bishop, there was a man whose hands were crescent-shaped, and he only had 2 fingers, and his feet were similarly formed. And if there was a race like him, it would be added to the history of the curious and wonderful. And then he asked the question, shall we therefore deny that this man is descended from that one man who was first created? And the answer implied there is, no, he bears God's image. And he goes on to say, as for the androgyny, or hermaphrodites as they're called, though they're rare, yet from time to time there appears persons of sex so doubtful that it remains uncertain from which sex they take their name. Though it's customary to give them a masculine name, but no one will deny that these are all descended from that one man. Here's how Augustine describes an intersex person. He sees a fellow human being capable not only of redemption in Christ, but also capable of being assigned into one of the two binary categories of male or female. And folks, that's a lot of information to hit you on one night. So what do we do with all that intel? Let me tell you another story. If I could direct your attention to the screen again. You're looking at a child named Melissa Phillips. Like Jazz, I chose Melissa for a couple of reasons. Melissa was featured on NBC News, so it's not like I'm exploiting this child. Melissa is the grandchild of a California congressman who made Melissa his political mascot, and Melissa is representative of a growing number of children who was born male, but is trying to transition to female with the help of parents, politicians, and the public. So what do you do if your child or a child in your ministry has a similar struggle? When I began to study the transgender issue, I did a lot of research, which means I read both sides of the aisle. And I read some of the leading supporters of child gender transition. People Melissa would go to get help to transition. One of them was named Dr. Norman Spack, a Harvard Medical School professor and pediatric endocrinologist. Here's what he had to say about children like Melissa. He said, remember, he helps kids transition. He said 80% of prepubescent children who identify as the opposite gender will change their minds, while 20% will persist. Let that sink in, according to the experts. 4 out of 5 times, when you have a little boy who says, I think I'm a little girl and I want to be a little girl, if you just leave him alone, 80% of the time, what's going to happen? They're going to realize that they're really just a little boy. In 4 out of 5 cases, the distress will resolve naturally, unless they're affirmed. They will outgrow. The technical term for that is desistance. Even the most radical transgender activists recognize and debate desistance rates. Children who don't grow out of it are termed persistent. So how do we treat them? Here are the 3 options, and all 3 are viable options, and I put our secular worldview and Christian worldview up there from the first night to remind you. 3 ways children with gender dysphoria are treated today are gender affirmation, the therapeutic approach, and watchful waiting. Gender affirmation is the secular view. They assume the child is correct because they believe every child is born a tabula rasa, a blank slate. So the child is innocent and will make good or neutral choices unless they're interfered with. They believe the child has autonomy, so if the child, a little boy, says, I want to be a little girl, it's society's responsibility to do what? Affirm and help them become a little girl. That's gender affirmation. The second is the therapeutic model. That assumes the child is confused and intervenes to ease distress by helping the child accept their natal gender. The third is watchful waiting. Watchful waiting makes no assumption. It just steps back and lets the child explore with limited interference, assuming that 4 out of 5 times the gender dysphoria will desist. Which one of these is most popular today? The gender affirmation, almost to the exclusion of the other 2. So I'm going to walk you through a typical gender affirmation process. It begins with what's called social transition. And I bet a lot of you have seen this or read about it in the news or experienced it when a child dresses and acts like the opposite gender. Boys are encouraged to wear girls' clothes, participate in sports as a girl, use the girls' bathroom. And the most crucial point is when the child selects a new name. Typically, that's the starting point. Melissa Phillips has clearly been in stage 1 for an extended period of time, which means that child is a candidate for phase 2, chemical transition. And this is the defining line. Up to this point, the child can transition back without any physical consequences. But once they start chemicals, 4 things happen. Number 1, money becomes a major factor. For some of these chemicals, it could cost up to $1,000 a month for the rest of their lives. So who pays for it? That's number two. Insurance companies become a major factor. They don't want to pay for anything, do they? And number three, the effects of some chemicals are permanent. Teens and now even children, boys are being blasted with estrogen. Girls are being blasted with testosterone. These hormones change the body. Yes, they promote what we call secondary sexual characteristics, like hair growth on women, but they also affect your heart, your liver, your bones, your moods. Some of those changes never go away. And finally, chemical transition is one step for adults, but two steps for children. Kids are now being administered puberty-suppressing hormones that block the onset of secondary sexual characteristics that occur during puberty. We have no idea what the long-term consequences of these hormones are going to be on young kids. But it's happening in our culture. Finally, after chemical transition is underway, the transgender person can pursue surgical transition. Sometimes this is called sexual reassignment surgery. Now it's popularly termed corrective surgery. This is what most people think about when they hear transgender, but it actually consists of a series of irreversible surgeries that will occur throughout the remainder of the transgender's life. These surgeries could cost over $250,000. This is a subject I've written on extensively. Due to its graphic nature, I'm not going to get into it here, but if you have questions, I would be happy to answer those with you afterwards. And even after going through phase 1, 2, and 3, there are a growing number of individuals who still desist. That's called trans regret, which indicates that treating humans as purely physical beings, the way our culture does, hits them with chemicals, surgically corrects. It doesn't solve that inner problem, that God-shaped hole Blaise Pascal once described. Two thoughts to leave you with. First of all, what causes gender dysphoria in children? The answer, we really don't know. It's one thing we can all agree on. There's a big debate. Is it nature? Is there a gene or a chemical at birth? Or is it nurture? Okay? These are just the facts. There's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that a child's environment has a huge impact on the development of gender dysphoria. Here are some things that have been noted. First of all, as I discussed last night, sexual abuse, sexual trauma has a huge impact on kids who are gender dysphoric. A disproportionate number of them have been abused. Other factors include emotional abuse, specifically by parents. If there's a mother who always wanted a daughter and she had a son, so she puts a dress on him, that child can develop some unhealthy behaviors. Many gender dysphoric kids come from dysfunctional homes. A recent study revealed that a surprising number of kids who are gender dysphoric also tested high on the autism end, high-functioning autism, especially female to male. They're very concrete. They think boys like to wear jeans, like to wear t-shirts, like to play sports. Hey, I like to wear jeans, I like to wear t-shirts, I like to play sports. I must be a boy. That's how sometimes they're being pushed in that direction. Mental illness plays an issue. Social media exposure plays an issue. All this to demonstrate that while a Christian worldview of total depravity can allow for both nature and environment, it seems that environmental factors play a big role in gender dysphoria. We'd be foolish to ignore them or try and treat them with puberty suppressors. Because GnRH agonists, puberty suppressors, they're not going to help a child who's been sexually or emotionally abused. And by now, I hope you're wondering what will. I'll tell you what will help. Number one, a biblical worldview that helps them see their gender and their sexuality as a gift of God established at the foundation, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The second thing, the biggest thing that can help a gender dysphoric child is a healthy relationship with the same-sex parent or role model within the church. Okay? The more secure the child feels, the less distress they're going to experience. But remember, these things are also correlated factors. So sometimes a gender dysphoric child can come from a perfectly healthy home. Third, remember, not dealing with sexual trauma can have a huge impact on a child. A lot of these kids who are struggling with gender dysphoria later in life share that there's a common denominator in sexual trauma, which is why I was compelled to share what I shared last night. And finally, social media plays a huge role in kids questioning their gender identity. And for many kids who struggle with gender identity, one of the first things parents have done when they step in to intervene is to take away social media. You can see a change almost immediately. I'm passionate about this issue because this is the subject of my dissertation. Also, in writing about puberty suppression early, I'm not here to promote myself. If you know someone who has a child who's considering puberty suppressors, I wrote a book, The Danger of Puberty Suppression, that goes into detail into what these drugs do to the human body. Okay, this is a clear violation of the Hippocratic Oath. These are dangerous and untested drugs when it comes to treating gender dysphoric children with GnRH agonists. If you know someone who is thinking about having their child begin puberty suppressors, I'd highly recommend you take a look at this because it addresses these issues from a holistic and biblical perspective. Thanks for your attention. I know this is a touchy issue. These are all touchy issues. But let's face it, it's really difficult to raise a child in a culture that questions what's a man, what's a woman, what's right, and what's wrong. I hope this gives you a foundation to go and to make a difference in one child's life. Tomorrow night we'll deal with substance abuse. Saturday night we'll close with cutting, suicide, and self-harm. Would you please join me in a word of prayer as we close our evening together, and then I'll turn it over to John Owen. Heavenly Father,